Good morning, Liberty. It is Monday morning, April 15th, 2019. My name is Michael Bolden, broadcasting to you live from my home office and studio here in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time here on the West Coast. So good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be watching, whether it's live or in the archive. I'm very grateful for you spending a little time with me today, and I hope you had a wonderful weekend. It was my partner Sarah's birthday over the weekend, so I got a little relaxation, and it was pretty awesome. For those of you who follow me on Facebook, on my personal profile, you'll see some pictures of the very awesome weekend that I was able to have, and I hope you had a really good one as well. Now, today, of course, is not a happy day, not a day to celebrate. It is tax day, tax theft day, tax stealing day, income tax filing day, unless they change the date. Sometimes in recent years, it's either the 16th or the 18th. I often have to file extensions. And yes, although I believe taxation is theft, the long arm of the IRS is very dangerous, and that is a risky one to face head on, especially in the work that I do. So I'm not on board philosophically, but out of fear, absolutely. So today I want to talk about that. And I guess I could really do the whole podcast with just 3 episodes, 3 words. Taxation is theft, because that is the message that I want to share today. And while there are people that I think would be far better suited to sharing that message, the philosophical underpinnings of that, of course, you want to read Murray Rothbard and his work. You can find a lot of this stuff over at the Mises Institute, Mises.org, or of course my friend Tom Woods. The Tom Woods Show is really good stuff. Bob Murphy does really good work. Alex Merced is another good guy to listen to. There's a lot of people in this kind of broader liberty movement, wherever they fall on the spectrum of that really do better with the philosophical underpinnings of taking someone's property. So I just really want to focus primarily, although a lot of people who take that same position that I do, taxation is theft, they often scorn or scoff at the founders of the founding generation, calling them statists, bad guys, setting up a bad system, that they're clueless. But if you really think about the idea of taking someone's property without their consent, including taxation, as being a form of robbery or a form of stealing or theft or government-sanctioned robbery, whatever it may be, the philosophical underpinnings, the history behind that, the predecessor to this viewpoint really came from the founding generation, or the revolutionary, the pre-revolutionary times. And I want to share a few quick stories about that, some of my favorite quotes, and you guys can kind of connect all the dots on this going forward from there. But before doing that, a quick hello to some friends out in the live chat who are watching. We are streaming live through, let me just make sure, we're streaming live everywhere that I want to be streaming. We're streaming live over on our YouTube channel, Facebook, Periscope, Twitter, and of course now today for the first time over on DLive. So I really appreciate everyone who's joining me, and some people that I'm seeing out in the chat. Chris Branco, good to see you over on Facebook. Tyler, Joseph, Anna, George, Larry, David, Frank, and a few others over on YouTube, David Webb, over on Facebook as well. I appreciate you guys all joining me. Justin leaves a great quote here: to compel a man to furnish funds for the propagation of ideas he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. I should look that up. I've not seen that quote from Thomas Jefferson, but he's citing Jefferson on that. David Michael says, good evening from Europe. Anna says, happy birthday. And Unique to Routine says, hey, guy, over on Periscope. So thank you, guys. Let's get right to it. The first, I think, the big springboard for resistance to the British Empire in the pre-revolutionary days was about taxation. And a lot of what they had to say back then sounded a lot closer to what we talk about today, those of us who are in the taxation is theft mentality. And in fact, even the first Supreme Court justice, the first, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had a view far closer to taxation as theft than, I guess, anybody in political office today that I'm aware of, far closer to that. Think of this. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is generally one of the most powerful people on earth. Even if you think of the Supreme Court as less powerful or more powerful, whatever it may be, there aren't more than a few hundred people that have this level of power over society, at least in ours and sometimes worldwide. And the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court actually was far closer to the message of taxation is theft entirely than anything that most of our neighbors and friends and family members ever say today. So I think that in and of itself says a lot about that philosophical underpinning. Ula Tinsley, good to see you. Okay, Michael, since you don't say hello to us peeps on Twitter, I'm checking in on Facebook now. Appreciate that. And also hi to Richard and Jamie. So the first story that I want to share is just a quick one about the Massachusetts Circular Letter. This was shortly after, this was in the time of the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts and the Declaratory Act. This was all about taxation. And this is an article by Andrew Tylock from late last year, September 2018, and he writes, a roughly 11-year period of slowly escalating unrest and displeasure with the actions of the British Parliament towards its colonial territories led up to the military altercations of the Revolution. The British Parliament's passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, which taxed colonists on paper necessary for legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards, is widely viewed as the catalyst of this period. Of course, it gets down to taxation, and they weren't even talking about income taxation, which is a whole nother beast in comparison. They were talking about just the ability to conduct business, to do transactions, to write, to communicate with friends and family, which we do through text, through email, through all kinds of things. And they had to pay a tax on all of these things. And Andrew goes on and he says, while the Stamp Act is exhaustively covered in history books, its implementation only lasted a year, if even. A lot of it wasn't implemented, and the act was ultimately repealed in 1766. This was a decade-ish before the start of the Revolution. And he goes on, he says, the repeal of the Stamp Act did not occur because the British Parliament saw the error of its ways. That, I think, is the message for those of us who want to get rid of the income tax. And it's not to replace it with another one. But we have to recognize that these people in power aren't all of a sudden going to be like, oh, you're right, taxation is theft. And we should have gotten rid of this a long time ago. Let's just cut it out. That will never, ever, ever happen at all. I would love to be wrong. I guess in the 1 in a trillion chance that I'm wrong, or is it 22 trillion? Chance that I'm wrong, they'll end it themselves. But I don't see it ever happening. He goes on, he says, parliamentarians didn't suddenly embrace the idea of no taxation without representation. And of course, I think that's the biggest distinction between the view of that time and the view of many people who oppose taxes as a philosophical, moral, or a property rights issue today, is that the founding generation, the revolutionary times, they were concerned primarily with being able to choose the people who would levy the taxes. And because they couldn't be engaged in a far-off government, they saw it as being taxed without any representation. Now, even though we supposedly have representatives in the Imperial Congress today, I don't think anyone can make the claim that the average person is truly representative. I would say today you could actually put this same slogan out there, that we are being taxed without representation. It is a representation on paper only. He says, Andrew goes on and he says, the repeal occurred because the Stamp Act was seen as an internal tax on the products of America, and the colonists refused to pay it. In fact, they actively opposed the collection of the tax and effectively nullified it through their efforts. And Dave Benner has done some really good writing on this. I did a series of videos, 3 short videos that covered this as well. I should have linked to it. I apologize. Otherwise, everything else that I'm talking about should be listed in the show notes, both on Facebook and Twitter. And then also, of course, if you're not Facebook and Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. And we have all of our archives and all of our show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty, all spelled out. It's a long URL, but it'll take you right to the proper page on our blog where you have all of our archives. That's really the best place to follow everything because you can easily scroll through all the past episodes. Over time, I'm going to improve on this page, and we're going to make it searchable by topic and categories. You can find episodes that relate to various categories, but that's probably a summer project. So Andrew makes a great point here. He says, when one head of the Hydra is cut off, two grow in its place. And that's my view. Even though I am no expert on the issue, that's my view on any income IRS replacement proposal that I've seen today. Whether it's a flat tax of whatever percent, or the fair tax, which is a national sales tax. If you cut off one, and especially if you give it power to do the same thing but in a different way, people are going to use it in a really bad way. And that's, I think, the difference in a lot of the proposals that we see today with how the founding and the revolutionary generations actually viewed this type of thing. They looked at the long-term principle that if you can do this, how is someone in the future going to be able to use it? And I don't think I really hear that from people talking about replacing the IRS, from the small percentage of people who are on board with this type of thing or pushing to make it happen. So Andrew goes on, he says, alongside the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, the British government passed the Declaratory Act, which extended the same authority that Parliament had over the British Isles to colonial America, asserting it could legislate in all taxes whatsoever. The Declaratory Act provided legal legitimacy in the eyes of the British to tax Americans as they please. So they repealed the Stamp Act because they couldn't enforce it, and there was such great resistance to it. And then they just passed something else that had the same philosophical underpinnings that allowed them to do the same in the future. This was also called the American Colonies Act. It created the framework for the British government to levy heavy taxes, Andrew writes, on the colonies and paved the way for passage of a collection of bills known as the Townshend Acts. So basically, you stop one, and if you turn a blind eye to another power that does basically the same, you're going to have the same, if not worse. So this is kind of the philosophical basis for much of the revolution, was this opposition to far-off government having arbitrary power that you couldn't actually do anything about. And I think we're facing kind of the same situation today, but that's another show entirely. So a few other items that I wanted to share. This might be a shorter episode than normal, but back in 1772, a follow-up after years of resistance, 1765, the Stamp Act, 1767, the Declaratory Acts, and then the Townshend Acts. And then discontent is building up and up and up. They're trying to oppose or trying to stand for liberty. And here's Samuel Adams. This was actually misattributed, I believe, by Ben Franklin at some point. But he wrote the preface to this for the publication. From Samuel Adams, The Rights of Colonists. This is from the pen of Samuel Adams. I know no one ever actually called him Sam back then. And here's an interesting quote. In 1772, this, I think, is also very similar to what we hear today from very strong libertarians. The supreme power cannot justly take from any man any part of his property without his consent in person or by his representative. And I think that's just the difference. So you have the same philosophical foundation that government cannot justly or rightly take any of your property. It doesn't matter if it's a computer, a car, a horse, a dog, cash, income, whatever. The difference then comes in is that the founders believe that proper representation could get the job done. And whether you agree with that or not, I think is not really the point that I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to convince you of one side or the other. But I think there's the very similar viewpoint. And I would make the case, again, that we don't have actual representatives today. And he goes on and he says, now, what liberty can there be where property is taken away without consent? So if you do not have the ability to keep your own property without making the choice to actually let it go, then you don't actually have liberty. Some people today say you can't have a country without a border, or you can't have this, you can't have a security without a massive national defense system or lots of spying. We heard under the Obamacare years that you couldn't have freedom from fear, they would say, without having the ability to have government control the healthcare system. That's far different than what we heard back then, which is, what liberty can there be where property is taken away without consent? And every single government program relies upon property taken away. And I think in most situations, it really is by consent. Because if you had a truly voluntary income tax system, how many people would just donate? Maybe there are people who are just love the government. Or I think what would happen is, in these days, Democrats would stop donating when the Republicans are in power, and Republicans would stop donating when Democrats are in power. Maybe. It'd be interesting to see. The next one that I want to cover is actually a few years later, just 2 years later, the address to the people of Great Britain. This was basically a warning from John Jay, who ended up serving as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I think this is the one that is most interesting to me, because here's a guy that was this is a lawyer, a legal expert, top of the system in the Supreme Court. You cannot name any Supreme Court justice or any federal judge in modern times that would take a position like this. And again, it's very similar. He's writing, of their friendship with Britain. We want to just be friendly, but there's a problem. And he says this, that we consider ourselves and do insist that we are and ought to be as free as our fellow subjects in Britain, and that, quote, no power on earth has a right to take our property from us without our consent. And I think, again, that is the same type of philosophical underpinning that we hear from our libertarian and ANCAP friends today, that taxation is theft. I agree with them completely. John Jay, of course, would take the position that you have to have proper representation. As long as you have proper representation, then you're giving consent. Now, that's where it differentiates, but the general view, the underlying principle, is again the same. The next comes from the constitutional times. Once the Constitution was instituted, people like Alexander Hamilton, who was sneaky about it all through the ratification process, telling people that it would mean one thing when all along he didn't like how it was approved at the Philadelphia Convention. He just sold it, and he wanted to worm his way into developing more centralized power. He was a piece of garbage. And of course, he wanted to institute a national bank. He loved central banking. But Thomas Jefferson wrote to oppose that in 1791. And this is not necessarily the same thing as taxation is theft, but I think it's, again, a very interesting view that is so far different than what all modern politicians say today. You don't hear anyone in Washington, D.C. say things like this: to lay taxes to provide for the general welfare of the United States. That is to say, to lay taxes for the purpose of providing for the general welfare. He says, for the laying of taxes is the power, and the general welfare the purpose for which the power is to be exercised. They are not to lay taxes ad libitum, for any purpose they please. My Latin is garbage. But only to pay the debts or provide for the welfare of the Union. Jefferson goes on, he says, in like manner, they are not to do anything they please. Of course, government today does anything they please, as long as they can convince enough people that it is for, quote, the general welfare, or, I don't know, they convince. Usually it's fear that people are going to be dying in the streets, and they have to assume extra power, and of course they have to rip everybody off to get it done. He says, to consider the latter phrase not as describing the purpose of the first, but as giving a distinct and independent power to do any act they please, which might be for the good of the Union, would render all the preceding and subsequent enumerations of power completely useless. So if they can just tax for any purpose, then of course there's no point in having a constitution. There's no point. And that's how it exists today. I mean, not that there's no point, but it's non-functional. And they do tax for any purpose they please. They tell us, I mean, it takes tax money to have all these unconstitutional agencies, the ATF, the DEA, the EPA, all these things take a ton of money. And if you listen to my video, or you watch my video on how Thomas Jefferson dealt with the national debt, it was like a 2-minute video. The script from Mike Meharry was really good. Jefferson, when he was president, he was complaining about the size of the national debt at a time when there was only about 130 non-military employees. Think of that again in comparison today. How many politicians would ever go to Washington, D.C. and say, oh man, 130 employees, we got to make some cuts? No. They always talk about even reducing the increase in the size of the growth as a cut. They don't even call a cut a cut. A cut to Washington, D.C., modern politicians today, a cut means an increase. It's just less of an increase. That's politician speak today. Over in the chat, Fred Hepting says, interesting that we got the Federal Reserve the same year. Lots of usurpations in the 20th century. Certainly, yeah. And we see the memes over the years that say 1913 was a very, very bad year. Scott says, at the turn of the century, many amendments were passed, and I have to wonder if they were passed or done so legally. So many things changed. 16th, 17th Amendment to a few others. Dan says, talking about a loophole, our elected representatives all agree to take. Eric Nance says, the debt is, appreciate your support, Eric. The debt is taxes on our posterity, being taxed without even a semblance of representation. And that is a very good point, Eric, because it's basically what I'm trying to say here too, and maybe not even very well, is that when they don't follow the Constitution, they aren't representing you. And almost everything the federal government has done in modern times is not in line with the Constitution as passed. So they're just exercising power. And maybe it's a popularity contest or whatever it may be. Maybe they're representing regions or special interests or donors or whatever it may be. They are not acting as representatives as their job is described. So yeah, I would say personally that we're being taxed without representation. So even at that level, it would be far closer to real liberty than anything anybody is proposing today. So Jefferson talked about this, and Thomas Paine was concerned about taxes and recognizing taxes were one of the things. Well, this is an interesting thing. He was debating with Edmund Burke over the French Revolution, and he's talking about the history of the British Empire. And he says, in reviewing the history of the English government, its wars and its taxes, a bystander not blinded by prejudice nor warped by interest would declare that taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but that wars were raised to carry on taxes. And this, to me, is one of the most dangerous parts of having such a massive taxation system in place. And whether it's under the IRS and everyone doing filing, or I've seen proposals to get automatic deductions done from your income, or if it's a national sales tax, as long as they're collecting tons and tons of money, whether by electronic means or physical money or checks, whatever, as long as they have the money, they're going to continue doing things to justify spending the money. And mind you, even with the huge amount of money they take in, we're talking $22 trillion in national debt. It is insane. Insane. Sean Coomer says, irony, don't pay taxes, get violated and jailed for tax evasion, and live off taxes you never paid. I can't imagine it being too great of a living, but certainly they do spend a lot of money on things like that. William says they're doing everything without representation. They don't tell the public anything otherwise. Their deal against, yeah, they don't. The debt is generational, David Michael says. Justin Bayola points out that Wilson was the head of this dragon called income taxes. I'm sure there were people who wanted it earlier. Certainly the Marxists, from Marx, a progressive income tax was part of what they wanted to build a centralized socialist communist state. That is one of the key parts of it. And we posted a meme over on our social channels, Minds, Facebook, and Twitter, maybe on Instagram as well this morning, earlier today. Basically, no founder asked for a progressive income tax. No founder wanted a direct income tax either. They weren't really in favor of these things. And in regards to war, the dangers of having them have so much money leads to war. James Madison put it this way. This was in 1795, a paper called Political Observations on April 20th, 4/20, 1795. No, Madison wasn't smoking anything, but he was saying armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. And if you think about how Paine was talking about how once they take the taxes, they're going to continue doing things to justify having it. Because if you have to ramp up the military empire or any particular office for a temporary, and I put, for those of you just listening, I put temporary in quotes, I'm making some air quotes. Soon as you put a temporary program in place, you're going to hear groans all over the place if you try to cut that program after that so-called temporary emergency is over. And in fact, part of the military-industrial complex program is every time they institute a new program or build a new I think maybe even the F-35 might fall under this. They build the product in so many different states that it's almost impossible to get rid of. So you have people in a factory in one state making a wheel, and another state making part of a wing, and another part making a navigation system, and then you spread it all over the place. And this is done, I believe, intentionally to make it harder to get rid of the program, because you're going to find opposition in many regions of the country. So Madison, his full quote is this: "Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War," he says, "is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few." So the father of the Constitution tells us that one of the three great threats to liberty is taxes. No one should be okay with rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic when they're opposing the IRS and just proposing some other version. A great article that I read years ago in my kind of transition from Marxist to wherever I am today, constitutionalist, 10th or whatever, leader of the radical right according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, was from Harry Browne. Harry Browne was very influential on my thinking. He wrote an article back on April 15th, 2003, Freedom from the Income Tax, and he pointed out that, quote, "Many people aren't aware that America, conceived in liberty in 1776, didn't have a permanent income tax until 1913. And I think a lot of people aren't even aware of this. I'm sure everyone watching or listening to this program is probably aware of that. But a lot of the general public just assumes this is part of life. Maybe they don't even think about it. Like, who will build the roads? Well, there were roads that existed before 1913. There was a military that existed before 1913. The government did stuff before 1913. If you want government to do stuff, it did without an income tax. It just is not able to do nearly as much. And it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. If today you are okay with everything government does, you are a complete idiot. Even people who want huge government. Huge government programs. On the left, generally social programs. On the right, generally military and surveillance programs, or drug control, drug prohibition programs. So wherever you are, and the general Republican, Democrat, left and right, or whatever they are, right and left, I don't know, they're all bad. They all want massive programs. And so therefore, they're on board with huge taxation because it has to come from somewhere. And as soon as you empower your team to do something, the other team is going to use that power for something else. No one likes everyone's programs. The left, who wants bigger government than there is today, don't like the Trump version of it. And the Trump version of government, who many Trump supporters are in love with, they call him, I've heard so many times, this is the greatest president in modern times. Sometimes I actually heard someone say to me that this is the greatest since Thomas Jefferson. And we're talking a national debt, increasing the national debt and the spending as bad or close to as bad as Barack Obama. So, if you're a constitutionalist, you can't be on board with this. So they're keep empowering their opposition by saying it's okay. Instead of opposing all of these programs all of the time, always calling for a cutback on the size and scope of the government, they're empowering their opposition to use it in the future. So Harry writes, for over a century, the U.S. government survived quite well without an income tax. It operated a small constitutional government on the revenue from tariffs and excise taxes. He says tariffs are taxes imposed upon imported products, and excise taxes are imposed at the manufacturing level on domestic products. Because those taxes affect the prices of products, they were self-limiting. I guess they would be self-limiting in my view if that was the only way they were collecting taxes. Now, if it's just a piece here, piece there, piece there, piece here, then they don't, if they want to do a huge program, they raise each little bit of them. They affect everybody a little bit here and there. Gas tax, for example, is a horrible one. And it's pretty significant. I see like 40, 50 cents, something like that, out of $3. The percentage is really high. The cannabis tax is really high on the state level. Can you imagine what they'll do on a federal level if they start doing a cannabis tax nationwide? I'm assuming the feds will kind of just run with that and go nuts. He says the taxes couldn't produce unlimited revenue to the government, is what Harry wrote. If a tax was raised too far, the product would be priced out of reach of the consumer, sales would fall, and tax revenues would fall. And I think this is the argument that people make for the national sales tax. But this, I don't want a tax. I don't want the federal government to continue to fund all the stuff that they do. I want it to run out of money and not be able to fund a vast majority, almost anything that they do. And Harry writes, he says, thus relying on tariffs and excise taxes, the U.S. government was able to raise only so much money and no more. The same was true of state and local governments. There were built-in limits to how much they could tax. So in 1913, when they imposed this nationwide income tax, and of course it was only going to be a few small points. Maybe someone knows from in the live chat. I think it was going to be 2% on the top, the richest of the rich, and no one else was going to pay. Well, how did that turn out? I know a lot of people complain that like 70 some million people don't pay income tax. Well, I think that's a good start. I would like it to see 350 million people making no income tax. So it's a good start. It's not, oh, things aren't equal. I hear this from the right more than from the left, which is interesting to me because the left supposedly wants bigger government. I never hear solutions about how they're going to pay for these things. I think the AOC kind of thing is, how are you going to pay for it? Well, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. In other words, they'll print money. They'll print us into oblivion. But the right does the same thing on defense spending, offense spending, because there isn't really defense. And they just don't have the money. I mean, they're taking the money by taxes, they print the money, they devalue the currency, and it creates a lot of problems. But Harry writes, as a result, in 1913, federal, state, and local governments combined took in taxes only 8% of the national income. Mind you, this was written in 2003, and he says today governments at all levels take 47% of the national income. That means you work half your life to support the welfare state. And now there's no topic on which politicians refuse to consider legislation. Your entire life is fair game for them to enact rules. And rules means regulatory bodies. Regulatory bodies means more taxation. Regulatory bodies means enforcement, which means more taxation. So again, it's a self-perpetuating thing. And if you look back at the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act and the Townsend Acts, these were tiny taxes on limited items. Certainly a stamp on all paper to conduct all transactions, to do all communications. This was significant. It invaded a big part of everyday life, but it wasn't on everyone's income. And even if I think the number is around 77 million people aren't paying income taxes, you're paying taxes everywhere else you go. Let's say I paid 0 in income tax. I wish. It isn't a huge amount. I'm not a big earner in this, I'll tell you that. But let's say I paid 0 in federal income tax. I'm still paying all kinds of other taxes throughout the rest of my life. And that's what I think Harry is talking about. Governments at all levels as of 2005. I would love to see some statistics of what it's like to go beyond that. 47% is massive. Russell asks a good question over on Facebook. I don't disagree. So we have the philosophical underpinnings. I don't necessarily have the answer to this. However, where does the Fed get the money to function? I think the first answer is that the federal government, almost everything they do is not authorized by the Constitution. So the problem is that they are they're engaged in stuff they're not supposed to do. So then once you start a program, then of course people become dependent on that program, and then cutting that program becomes a problem. So it's this kind of self-serving, self-perpetuating cycle. If the government was just in its constitutional limits, which it's never going to do on its own, mind you. Constitutions don't enforce themselves. Words on paper don't do something or fail to do anything. It's up to people. It's up to the market, the population at large, to hold the government to its limits. The market doesn't seem to want to do that at this stage in history. But if the government was operating within its constitutional limits, I think it could probably operate at less than probably 2% of what it is. I mean, I'm just throwing out a number, but some tiny amount. And it's through tariffs and excise taxes. And that's not to say that all tariffs that we see today or in recent times are a good thing, because they're done on top of the massive national income tax and all the other taxes that we see around the country. And Larry Clark also points out that inflation is also a tax increase. So as they print money, the people at the top of the food chain in the financial system, they get that money first. And then as it goes through the economy, the trickle-down effect is that it circulates through the economy. And then as you and I get that money in our paycheck or however we get the income, it takes more dollars to buy the same products, which is a nasty tax. That's what Ron Paul has called it. He calls inflation one of the worst taxes. And Harry asks two important questions in this article. He says, what have politicians done to earn that money? Almost nothing. What claim should they have on your earnings? Absolutely none. He says absolutely nothing. They've done nothing to earn this. So in closing, I just want to share one other piece from one of my favorite founders. Chris Branco says they would be rolling in their graves. I think so. I think so as well. And even if they don't agree, like, you don't have to be all the way to one. You don't have to agree completely on everything. But the philosophical underpinning, I think the foundation is that they're taking this money without consent. They're enacting programs that they shouldn't be enacting. And as long as they're doing that, it is stealing in my books. And this is from John Dickinson. This was in response to the Townsend Acts. He wrote a series of letters in 1767 and 1768 called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. This is part of what brought him to fame. Even though he wasn't known as a leading founder, he isn't one of the founding fathers, but in the pre-revolutionary times and leading up to the revolution, he was considered the penman of the revolution. Thomas Jefferson thought he was one of the greatest advocates of liberty that ever lived. And he talked about that maybe he was being kind at his death. But in the 12th of these letters, he says, let these truths be indelibly impressed on our minds, that we cannot be happy without being free, that we cannot be free without being secure in our property, that we cannot be secure in our property if without our consent others may, as by right, take it away, that taxes imposed upon us by Parliament do thus take it away, that duties laid for the sole purpose of raising money are taxes, that attempts to lay such duties should be instantly and firmly opposed. And you can read that whole thing. I linked to the Liberty Fund, simple version of it, the full 12 letters. Plus there's another series of articles from Richard Henry Lee that are awesome there. I've got this all over in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. Eric Nance makes a good point. Shrink the government so this argument is over billions or less instead of trillions. Brian Brunn says 99% of their functions are unconstitutional. I would take, at this point, I'd take 50. I personally think it's like somewhere around 90, 95%, most of what they do. I've often made the case that basically, if you didn't even pay attention to anything that the federal government did, and you just heard about a regulation or a law or an executive order, and on everything you heard, you just automatically said, nope, unconstitutional, you would be right 9 out of 10 times, 99 out of 100. Better than most. And I would take those odds over just about anything. And that really is the problem. As long as people are okay with government being involved in every aspect of their lives, and I don't think there are many people who want that, but they want government involved in many aspects of other people's lives, controlling them and telling them what to do. And then somehow they're surprised when government wants to be involved in various aspects of their own lives. So we have to stop supporting government power over other people, and that's the only way forward. I know people who believe in liberty, who believe in a limited government under the Constitution, everywhere from libertarians to ANCAPs and everything in between. I think we are all on board on this. The key is, how do we bring this message to more and more people? Of course, if you think this isn't too radical, what you can do is you can hit that like button, smash the like button, leave some comments, share the link with your friends and family, whatever platform you're watching or listening on. All those free actions, they actually trigger the platforms that you're on. They're all very easily triggered, and that will tell them to show it to more people. I really appreciate you joining me today. Very unhappy tax day to all of you, and we'll be back on Wednesday and Friday, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. I hope you have an awesome Monday, and I think it's very awesome that you spent some time with me today. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.